I am Melanie Dunshee, the Assistant Dean for Library Services, and it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to this discussion and celebration of Jedediah Purdy's new book, After Nature. You are likely probably to have seen or heard something about this book since it's been reviewed widely and also was recently on NPR as well, interviewed on NPR. So we are pleased now to hold this event for our community and hear from Jed in this discussion led by Professor Lisa Kern Griffin as well. So the Goodson Library supports our faculty in many ways in creating scholarship and making it widely available. So when Senior Associate Dean Guy Charles came to the library and asked if we would work with the Dean's Office to celebrate and recognize monographs written by the law school faculty, of course, we enthusiastically agreed. And this is our kickoff event for this new initiative, and I'm really glad so many people came to share it with us. I also want to thank our joint sponsors for this event. In addition to the Goodson Library, the Program in Public Law, with special thanks to Sarah Holzapfel and the Office of the Dean. And Professor Charles, you can introduce our people.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melanie. The library was absolutely fabulous, and Melanie, amazing, and putting this event together. And we're so grateful for our wonderful library and its great leadership. The Program in Public Law with Professor Siegel and Schrader were initial co-sponsors as well as initiators of this idea, so they ought to get the full credit. It is a pleasure to be on this faculty. There are so many erudite, thoughtful people. As you know from the students in this room, they speak in full sentences. They might have come that way. I'm not so sure. Their grammar is perfect. They're so smart. I often wondered what happened that they allowed me to join their ranks. And this afternoon, we are assembled to celebrate this absolutely amazing book and our colleague. And of course, we have two fabulous people in conversation, Lisa Griffin, Professor Griffin, who many of you know, legendary academic and professor. The students absolutely adore and love her. And of course, the same can be said about my colleague, Professor Purdy. His talents are not just writing beautiful books, thinking great thoughts, but I'll tell you, if you're interested in eating a great goat, please see Professor Purdy. So I'm going to now turn it over to our two conversationalists. I feel privileged that we can gather together as a community, and we will do this more often as our colleagues put their works together. And we are so happy now to be able to have this conversation. Thank you so much for doing it. And now over to the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guy and Melody. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Professor Charles is right. It is a pleasure to be on this faculty, and it is a pleasure today to have the opportunity to talk about Professor Purdy's book. It's a lyrical book, it's a scholarly book, and it's a book that also potentially makes a political intervention. And it is rare to see any two of those three things combined in our world, and that all three of them are in one volume is extraordinary, which is one of the reasons it's nominated for the Pulitzer and the reason that we're here today and privileged to have the chance to talk about it. It's a book that brings together your interest in the natural world and your scholarship on the meaning and obligations of living in a democracy. And one of the things that we talked about beginning with is the concept behind it. The word, you've called it a made-up word, but of course all words are made-up words. But the Anthropocene, what is that?
Yes, and before I start to answer that, let me just add my thanks to what's already been said, to people for being here. It's actually really touching both to see my students and people who aren't my students and my colleagues, and to be introduced by and be sitting here with people that I feel really warmly toward and feel really fortunate to be talking with. And you don't necessarily know this about your teachers, but Lisa Griffin is one of the finest readers on the faculty. And the reason I asked whether she would be willing to do this is that it's an honor to have something you write read by someone who reads with real care and intelligence and appreciation. So I feel very fortunate in a bunch of ways. So the subtitle of the book is Politics for the Anthropocene, which is more flagrantly made up than most words, right? And it's specifically made up as a proposed name for a new geological era, which we might be living in, like Jurassic or Pleistocene or Holocene. Officially, we've been living for the last 12,000 years or so in the Holocene era, which is Greek for totally new. The suggestion that we live instead now in something called the Anthropocene is a way of expressing in geological terms the idea that human beings have become a force in the development of the planet, and maybe the force in the development of the planet. And that if you were to look at the layers of soil, literally the archives of the history of the Earth that are now being created, and it's through those layers and through their fossil record particularly, that geological eras are traditionally named, you would find our fingerprints everywhere. They're in the chemical makeup of the air from the upper atmosphere down to the chemistry of the sea. They're in the mix of species that are present, and by implication, the many, many species that are gone in what's now called the sixth great extinction. Our fingerprints are in the total transformation of the use of the Earth's surface. In other words, the world that we inhabit is now in substantial part the world that we make. So to say that we live in the Anthropocene is on the one hand a name for a newly intensified condition where people are shaping the natural world, or that it's shaping the non-human world and being shaped by it in turn. But using that term, the Anthropocene, is not just, in my book, kind of scientific, or since I'm a law professor, pseudoscientific proposal about where we are. It's a kind of political and cultural gambit to say that if we use the idea of the Anthropocene as an occasion to recognize that we now are shaping the only world that we can inhabit, then maybe we can find ways to take collective responsibility for the decisions that are giving the world its shape. In this respect, I actually take a cue from our brilliant colleague, Jamie Boyle, who sort of offhand, probably 15 years ago, wrote, with reference to intellectual property, which is his main area, the observation that the idea of the environment, which so much of environmental law and environmental politics pivots around, was not obvious at all 50 or 60 years ago. If you had said, we have to do something about the environment, we need an environmental movement, no one would have understood that term to tie together a range of problems from runaway unregulated technology to air pollution to urban sprawl to litter to the threat of nuclear extinction to population dynamics. And so, in a sense, Jamie said, the environment had to be invented before it could be saved. That is, we needed a term that helped us collect the set of problems into a single concept and organize around it. And I see the Anthropocene as a term that potentially has some of the same power to gather people's thoughts and gather energy around it so that we can get hold of the problem we're in.
At the core of the book is this insistence on human agency, on the idea that we live in the world that we've made. And you're not just referring to the natural world when you talk about that. For you, there are other areas in which we need to accept that things are made and not born, and those include not just ecology, but also economics and the political world as well. Do you want to talk about those three different arenas in which you're making a call for an acceptance of responsibility, that things occur because we make them happen?
Yeah, that's wonderful and really helpful. So the title of the book is After Nature. And a part of what I mean by that is that there is no more nature in a certain specific sense. There's no more world that exists independently of us, that will be here after we're gone, that will go on in the same way regardless of what we do. The shape of our lives and the shape of the rest of the world are tangled together. And so in that sense, nature is not something natural anymore. That is, the non-human world is not something independent of human beings anymore. And I say in the book that this moment when nature isn't any longer natural is actually the most recent of three great modern denaturalizations. Three areas of life that were thought of as having their order independent of human decision and human agency, and so being natural in that sense, have come to be recognized as artificial instead. The first of these is politics. For a very long time, it was argued that the hierarchical order of command and obedience was a kind of natural or divine rule book that people just had to fill out. And in fact, that we could learn how human politics should be shaped by looking at the natural world. So it was favored to say, for example, the eagle is the king of the skies and the lion is the king of the desert and jungle, and this is how we know that humans are supposed to have kings too. And look, there he is, do what he says. And then one of the great insights of modernity of the last 300, 400, 500 years is that politics is not that at all, that it's an architecture, an unstable, dangerous architecture of power that's built with the crooked materials of human motivations and human cooperation. The second great denaturalization is the denaturalization of economic order. And this is the great lesson in law terms of legal realism that many of you will have encountered in legal theory with me or Professor Boyle or in the first year foundations course. That the economy is not something that has a natural shape that just presents itself to us fully formed and which we can then either respect or mess up. The economy is in many critical respects, in most of the respects that we care about, the product of political and legal decisions. So these three denaturalizations belong together, not just because the denaturalization of nature resembles the other two, but also because to understand how we're shaping the rest of the world, we need to see that these three areas of human activity, politics, economics, and our sort of ecological role, are nested together. That it's, in many respects, our economic lives that give the planet its shape. We're engaged in a kind of collective landscape architecture, just in the way that we get around, in the way that we find shelter, in the way that we stay warm in the winter or cool in the summer, in the way that we get our food. These are the very concrete ways that we drive climate change, the transformation of the Earth's surface, et cetera, et cetera. And the composition of our economic lives, its shape and its direction, is in, as far as it's subject to any kind of choice, that choice is exercised through politics and made concrete in political decisions. So the shaping of the world brings together these three kinds of order that aren't natural anymore: political, economic, and ecological. And so we have to be able to find a way to think of those all together.
So there's even more to this idea that things are moving and changing and constructed with our own hands and words. In order to do something about this thing we have named and take responsibility in the way that you suggest, there needs to be a way of feeling it and a shared vision, a cultural understanding of it, which brings me to the idea of environmental imagination, something that is at the heart of the book. What is that?
Yeah, it totally is. I think what I'll do is give a quick definition of environmental imagination and then say how I came to that idea, because it sort of begins in law school, and it has some relation to why I'm doing this work in a law school now. So when I talk about this book, I sometimes say that it's an intellectual history of environmental politics and lawmaking. And sometimes I say that it's a political and social history of environmental ideas. And I put it in those two kind of imperfect and overlapping ways. Because the book is, in some ways, a history of the ways that people have seen the natural world, the ways that they've imagined it, how they've valued it, why they've thought that it matters, and what they've thought that people have at stake in the way that we relate to it, what they think that we can get out of living in it in the right way, what they think might be in danger in living in it in the wrong way. I call all of those ways of thinking, which are not just ways of thinking, but also ways of seeing the world, and even ways of feeling it, forms of environmental imagination. And the core of the book is a kind of history of how the different legal regimes that have governed the human relationship to the natural world, especially in this country. In some sense, the history of environmental law, but of environmental law not just going back to 1970 with NEPA and the Clean Air Act, but going all the way back to independence. How those have both expressed and shaped different eras of environmental imagination, different ways of talking about and seeing and valuing and dealing with the natural world. So that the American landscape is literally a transcript of the ways that people have valued nature at different times. It's a transcript of those ways of valuing nature because it's a record of the ways that people have physically, materially, economically, and technologically lived on and shaped different parts of the continent under the guidance of these different legal regimes from different periods. So in this way, environmental imagination is both a very, I guess you could say, literary, abstract, ethereal sounding sort of thing. It's like trying to interpret how the world matters to people in a given time and place. It's a very cultural kind of idea. But it's also in this book, and I think actually in history, very closely connected to a much more practical and sort of material history of how things get shaped. And I think very frequently law is the linkage. Laws like the laws creating the agricultural landscape of the Midwest, creating the national forests, creating the irrigation system of the West, creating the national parks and wilderness areas, to name a few that you can look at, fly over or walk through and recognize as paradigms of different shapes of landscapes and different uses of landscapes. Those laws are all written in the service of a given idea of how nature is and how we should be with it, and have shaped, those laws have shaped those landscapes in turn. So I'm going to say the second part more quickly, because I don't want to take more than a few minutes in response to each question. I really want to hear what Lisa is going to ask. So when I was in law school, I took environmental law in, it's actually my first year, because we only had required courses in the first semester where I was. And I was so excited to take it. I had spent a year working full-time in environmental politics and sort of almost like environmental activist paralegal work. And I had the experience, and a lot of other people in the class, I think, had the experience of this enormous gap between the things that had brought us there, which often had to do with a very intensely felt personal connection to certain issues or certain places or certain species, things we had worked on or cared about. We felt a gap between that motive for being there and what we were learning, which was incredibly technical, dry, abstract from our reasons for being there. And you might say that that's always true of law, but I think it's true in a more dramatic way in environmental law than almost anywhere else. With all respect to my tax colleagues, most people don't expect tax law to be about the things that sort of move you in the most secret places of your heart. And constitutional law actually turns out to be about what we mean by liberty and equality and national community. Those are actually kind of, they work, they make sense. And in environmental law, it was very hard to find the bridge between why we were there and what we were learning. And so a classmate and I basically built an alternative syllabus of cultural and political history that we designed in parallel with the substantive materials we were learning. So like when you learn the Clean Air Act, why don't you also read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and try to think about what was happening in that moment when people came to understand how pollution could come out of a smokestack and move through air and through water and soil and then into a human body, because the world was this kind of interwoven system of systems, natural and industrial and human. And we convinced the teacher to let us, the next year, offer our alternative syllabus as a parallel to his course, as a section, sort of an extra credit discussion section. And ever since, I've been trying to think about how environmental law can be taught and studied in a way that respects the serious technical craft that obviously is what we're all learning to work with, but also respects the ways of caring about the natural world and responding to it that really are where it comes from in the first place.
Both the ways of caring that you're talking about and the intellectual history that you outline in detail in the book move. And one of the contributions of the book is this powerful sense that it can be moved, that the law of environmentalism and the politics of it in legislation like the Homestead Act or the Clean Air and Water Acts come from paradigms, different paradigms over time, and that there are shifts, as there always are in paradigms, and that at the same time, this imaginative world, this way of feeling that you're talking about that you wanted on your parallel syllabus, can be changed as well. It seems like your book is optimistic in that sense, because in a country where it is still a robustly successful political strategy to deny human agency in climate change, it's easy to throw up one's hands about these paradigms and whether things are moving. But you leave the reader with the sense that it can change, that there have been changes over the history of our country, that there can be global shifts in commitments to this, and that our way of feeling is unstable, just like the things you describe at the beginning of the book. Do you feel optimistic for that reason?
So, no and yes. I'll elaborate a little first. And this again goes in a way to where the book came from in relation to law school. And I think I can say this a little more succinctly. So I started teaching in environmental law here about 7 years ago. And one of the things that struck me in teaching the scholarship on climate change was how much of it seemed to me to be involved in a very intellectually sophisticated form of pessimism. That collective action analyses were deployed to show why we could expect never to do anything about this problem. Because its scale in time and in space outruns the scope of our political decision-making and our selfish concern. So I started to think that maybe we were thinking about it in the wrong way, that there are some kinds of problems that, in fact, people can't change, can't affect, can't solve, unless people change first, unless what they care about and what they're capable of achieving through political action changes. But of course, stated that way, that sounds sort of vapidly utopian. So I thought about historical examples where changes that were thought to be impossible, in which there were very good reasons to believe were impossible, turned out to be entirely possible, but were possible only because people changed in the course of wrestling with them. I thought then of the abolition of slavery in the Anglo-American world as one example, the revolution in relations between women and men and now in gender identity might be another. And so I wanted to ask an historical question, which was, have what you could call environmental questions also been a place where this kind of change has happened? So I went back, and what I found was that, in fact, at different times, people have been motivated to act in relation to the natural world in terrifically different ways. And that the priorities of one era might be shocking to the priorities of an earlier era. And when people, of course, come to care about things differently, they can accomplish things that they couldn't accomplish before. So the fact that that the scope of what our politics is capable of isn't just a bare fact that we're confronted with, but is actually in part a product of all of our own other decisions and all of our own cultural development and all of our little unsuccessful but incremental movements and efforts does seem hopeful to me. And it still seems hopeful to me in principle, looking forward at the question, let's say, of climate change, to think that this is not the first time that something has seemed impossible. And sometimes in the past, those things that have seemed impossible have happened. That said, I have to admit that if we try to imagine what, let's say, a democratic political decision-making process would look like that could work on the scale and match the difficulty of climate change and other environmental challenges. Right now, we are doing that kind of thinking is engaging in a kind of imaginative literature almost. You know, it's very hard to name the practical steps. And I think that can be frustrating for legal scholarship because so much of what we pride ourselves on is naming incremental practical steps that will accomplish the goal we've set out or move you in that direction. I think that's hard to do in this field now, but I don't think that is by itself reason to give up.
In terms of your ambitions for what's possible, a lot of them are about discourse and understanding what's going on more than practical steps. But one of the things you also say on this note about what is hopeful is that we have to accept the reality of a post-natural world. And as that acceptance becomes more widespread, there's a danger that one throws up one's hands and notices the raging storms and the rising seas, but feels that nothing can be done. And one of the things that you've said about this project is that accepting that we can't do anything about everything doesn't mean we shouldn't. We still have to do something. Or, as you put it in a different way, we may not be the ones we've been waiting for, but nobody else is coming. Which brings me to the, I think, really important idea at the end of the book about a democratic Anthropocene, about this discourse that could make a difference, or about the ambitions that you may have for what the project means in terms of what actually is possible, keeping the conversation going, not giving in to pessimism. So what is a democratic Anthropocene? We talked a little bit about you maybe reading something from the book, and I wonder if on page 268, the description of this is something you want to read.
Let's see. So it might make sense to, if I could, to read a couple of things from the book that I think sort of respond to this. Here are two, and I think they'll be responsive. So this is on 45 to 46 of the book. Politics will determine the shape of the Anthropocene. Consider one dystopian prospect. Earlier versions of nature, that is, forms of environmental imagination and ways of regulating the world, have concealed inequality among people, their landscapes, and their forms of life by naturalizing that inequality, treating it as a simple aspect of the given world. Theories of race and sex, of the inherent direction of history, or of the purpose for which the natural world is designed, have all done this work. Those are not gone, of course. Indeed, their traces are everywhere. but they're greatly weakened. The more distinctive and potent danger today is a naturalized version of post-natural human mastery. That is, the dangers in an approach to the Anthropocene that rhetorically embraces the need for humans to shape the world, that cuts off all avenues of radical and generative politics about how to do that, reducing our Anthropocene choices to a convenient minimum. As ecology, economy, and politics unite with growing intensity, the natural world itself will enforce unequal economic and political power. Wealth has always meant the power to resist natural shocks and carry on with one's life. Wealth commands vaccines and antibiotics, upland real estate safe from floods, reliable flows of food and water when drought strikes, and muscle and weaponry when the desperate and the opportunistic try to take those things for themselves. In these ways, natural catastrophe amplifies existing inequality. When sea levels rise, malaria spreads, and storms intensify, low-lying and poor regions will see their poverty confirmed by disasters for which no one can quite be blamed, while rich countries, even ones that have started out as haplessly as the United States has on climate change, will build seawalls and innovatively adaptive buildings and cities. The global atmosphere is a great launderer of historical contributions to and benefits from inequality. Everything washes out in the weather. The fact that Europeans enjoyed technological and immunological advantages over Native Americans and other indigenous peoples once seemed to show that they were favored by providence or racial destiny. In the same way, the disasters of the Anthropocene near future will seem to confirm the rich country's resilience, flexibility, entrepreneurial capacity, and that everlasting mark of being touched by the gods, good luck. But luck, of course, is the residue of historical and structural advantage. So, what I'm presenting there is a kind of worried picture of how things go if we don't rally to the call to find ways of taking responsibility for a world that we're making, and that we're making in a way that's going to deal vastly unequal consequences to different people and regions. And then the thing that I say about the idea of a democratic Anthropocene starts from an observation that Amartya Sen, the Nobel-winning economist, very famously made about famines, that no famine had ever taken place in a democracy, though there were many devastating famines up into the 20th century. The implication of this idea is that a natural catastrophe, let's say a climate catastrophe, is not only a natural thing, it's a joint product of natural phenomena and human decisions, including decisions about who we have to look out for and how resources are going to be distributed in answer to human need. So the recognition that the disasters of the Anthropocene, including the slow disasters like slowly rising heat, slowly rising sea levels, increased intensity and rates of violent storms, are the joint products of human and natural events, and that the people affected by them might have claims on one another to be provided for, looked out for, made reparation to. That's a beginning, but it's a very bare beginning. Also a beginning is the thought, a beginning of an idea of a democratic Anthropocene, is the thought that in some sense, everyone should have a voice and a hand and a vote in the decisions that shape the world that we're all going to have to live with. In some ways, that's the extension to the ecological question of the challenge that modern democracy has always presented to the question of economic order, which is if we all have to live under this interdependent order of greater and lesser power and wealth together, is there some sense in which we can also decide collectively what its shape and terms should be? That's in some ways what the Lochner fight was about, what the New Deal fight was about, and it's a contest that goes on today. But I want to say that I recognize that what I just said about the beginning of a democratic Anthropocene is very bare. It's very thin. And that's the problem that I'm acknowledging when I say that talking about that, a democratic Anthropocene, which I think is something we need and need to be able to talk about, is it's an exercise of imagination in the slightly pejorative or diminishing sense of imagination, that so far it's mostly that, and we need to get to more than that.
The other issue is that we need to get to a place where more people share the same imagination that you're talking about in the book. And one of the challenges of this is you've talked about the need for everyone to find something to fear and something to love in nature in order to participate in this discourse and feel responsibility for how we interact with the natural world. But most of the world's population is without the experiences and memories and even dreams that you have of interacting with the natural world. Most of the world's population is in a version of a concrete jungle and unable to access that. Is that part of what you're trying to address by talking about this environmental imagination, or what are the points of entry for people who don't share your very tactile and emotional connection to the natural world?
So I really appreciate that question. When Lisa says that I say that people need to find something to fear and something to love in the natural world, she's very elegantly summarizing my summary of what I found in tracing the major moments of transformation in environmental imagination, which was that when people came to speak about and act toward the natural world in new ways, it was usually both because there was some new perceived danger or threat that they were responding to, of running out of an essential resource, of poisoning themselves. But it wasn't only that. It was also that there was some newly available idea that they were moving toward of what you could gain from a better relationship to the natural world. And so that's sort of what I'm getting at when I say that the earlier transformations have involved both fearing something and trying to get away from a bad situation and trying to get toward a better way of relating to the world. That these sort of phrases sound nice, maybe, but they're also a summary of real forces in the change in past environmental politics and lawmaking. So the question that Lisa drives toward, I guess I could rephrase in a less charitable way, which is, who am I talking to here? Who is left out of this picture of environmental imagination, which can sound very much like luxury, kind of first world problem and opportunity to get to think about what kind of world you like to walk around in and what kind of world you like to imagine and look at pictures of on your screensaver. And I think, first of all, that the whole American history of environmental politics, environmental imagination, has a lot to answer for in exactly the dimension of who's left out. At a bunch of points, environmental politics has reinforced the pernicious inequalities of the time it was acting in. So theories about the natural world and the way that people should work to transform it and improve it and get a living from it, ideas about what counted as improving it, were an important part of the ideological justification of taking North America from Native Americans with minimum compensation at the beginning. There was an idea that it was the human duty to develop nature and make it bloom, and that the people who were already here were violating that human duty. This is actually a serious jurisprudential view of the 18th century. And so it was almost, if you will, like a human rights intervention to come here and take it away and start to grow things for sale. Later, you get more subtler things, like the politics that gives us the national parks and the national wilderness areas, what I call in the book a kind of romantic social movement that begins in the creation of the Sierra Club in the late 19th century in San Francisco, among other places, is, on the one hand, from my point of view, just about an unqualified good in terms of the legacy that it leaves us. On the other hand, it's unmistakably a very elite, white form of politics that says, quite literally, we speak for nature. We're going to be its voice and defender in the political process and secure some part of the landscape that is still going to be nature. And as for the rest of you, well, we're just going to have to cut our losses with those towns and factories and farms, even farms, since it was elite as well as white. Even worse, I trace in the book, I think, pretty much irrefutable connections in some of the early conservationists between their wish to save big trees and charismatic species that were going away, and their attachment to a certain kind of nostalgic Anglo-racism that was quite explicitly racist in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The same people who wanted to save the redwoods hated immigrants and wanted to keep them out. And it wasn't just because they thought the immigrants were going to be bad for the redwoods. It was because they thought the redwoods and Anglo-Americans were sort of deeply spiritually linked and they needed to keep the country pure. In fact, the guy who founded the first movement to save redwoods in the US also wrote a terrible book of racialized history, which Hitler apparently called his favorite book. Teddy Roosevelt blurbed that book and said it was an excellent book. Teddy Roosevelt was the great conservationist president of the early 20th century. These intersections are very uncomfortable. And one of many things you can say about them is that they have to do with people who are in positions of power and privilege being exceedingly comfortable and unself-questioning in assuming that they speak for the natural world. And so I think when we talk about trying to recast an environmental imagination, we're working with a double-edged sword. On the one hand, people are able to achieve remarkable political and cultural developments by treating the natural world as meaning something, having value, not just being a kind of neutral stock of resources that we can do whatever we want with. We get somewhere by having political and cultural arguments about what kind of nature we want. But that kind of argument has often turned into people pulling rank and asserting economic, cultural, and political power to call nature in on their side of the argument and leave other people out and disadvantaged. And I think that begins to look even worse when you start to think about the global distribution of the effects of climate change, for example. So have I answered it? I think that in a way I've restated the problem that Lisa is pointing us toward. And in some ways, here again, I think the idea of a democratic Anthropocene is partly intended to be a sort of perennial check against this tendency, once we're aware of its place in history, that when whole populations and ways of seeing are left out of how we argue about the meaning of nature, these kinds of histories that I'm pointing to and their moral blindness are the kind of thing that can happen.
So the future of nature is a political question, and we'll assume that you've persuaded not just those in American political discourse, but globally as well, because this is not an isolated problem. If it is a political question, I'd love a preliminary sense of what the answers might be. And I know it's not your project to catalog potential policy choices, but a sense of what the most urgent questions are would be helpful. And there's some passages at the end of the book that we talked about where you begin to extend this vision to what, once we've established this discourse, what are we going to engage with? What are we going to have to decide using it? Yeah. I don't know if you want to read or answer that, and then maybe our goal is to open it up for questions from.
Yeah, let me maybe I'll just say one thing. And this links environment with larger questions about economics and democracy. I think, excuse me, I think one of the many ways that the prospect looks bleak right now is that it's very hard to find a possible exception of Japan, which is interesting, which I haven't really thought about. It's hard to find an example of a country that's even minimally politically responsive. So not just the formal democracies, but also, say, China, where the stability or legitimacy of the government doesn't depend on the continued delivery of economic growth. And for all the improvements that we're making in the efficiency, the say per unit carbon expenditure or per unit of GDP energy load of our economic activity, the fact remains that as countries grow richer, their per capita impact on the planet's carrying capacity increases. And unless we find technological silver bullets that essentially decouple our consumption from natural resource use, that's going to continue to be true. And even if the rate of growth of resource load per unit of economic growth were to decrease, the total sum of economic activity continues to skyrocket. So in some ways we're asking, is there a way for political communities collectively and freely, and not only ultimately at the national scale, but ultimately at the global scale, to find ways to agree to reduce the total pressure that they're putting on the planet? To answer that question in the affirmative, you would need people to have ways of taking satisfaction in their lives that are less material, or at least less resource intensive in the ways that they're material. But I also think, and this is the point that I'm sort of driving toward, that you would need to have economies in which people could feel secure, in which people could feel safe. I think there's a sense in which insecurity at so many levels of life prospect, like the thought that if you have the opportunity, you need to make enough money to live in a neighborhood where you'll feel confident that your kids will be safe, to live in a jurisdiction where you'll have decent public schools or else to pay for private schools, to pay for decent health insurance, to pay for a college education that costs more than a house. I could go on. Makes it true in some sense that individually, rationally, you never have enough, or at least it's hard to know that you have enough. And when you make generalize that situation collectively, you create a situation where politically it's very hard to say, okay, slowing down growth seems acceptable, because it doesn't seem acceptable. It actually seems like, and it is, a chokehold on people's life prospects. So that's a difficulty that I think we may need to find our way out of on the level of how we organize our economies for people, if we're going to think about slowing down our economies for the rest of the world. Let me just stop there so that we can open it up.
All right, everyone. It's a lot to absorb.
Professor Boyle has a question.
Yeah, I think climate change perfectly reflects your three demonetizations. We're calling on elected officials to talk more about climate change. We're seeing this wave of clean tech and wind and solar becoming economical with coal burning. And of course, it's all centered around this environmental problem. But the environmental problem becomes salient to us only through urgency. And politics and the economy are much more salient in our everyday lives. So I'm wondering if you think something other than urgency could be infused into our everyday order for us to start thinking more about the environment?
That's a wonderful question. I really appreciate it. I think that one of the remarkable things about the modern world relative to the rest of human history is the way that the scope of what people care about has expanded selectively and not always with good results. But people are able to care about things like who made their t-shirt half a world away and in what conditions. And that's much further geographically, socially, culturally, linguistically than most of the scope of human concern has gone before. We're able to care about certain kinds of human rights violations half a world away in a place we can't even picture. So it seems possible to me, and this is really just kind of affirming the invitation of your question, to find urgent things that don't seem urgent now, to feel urgency across longer timelines, for example, or to recognize that the kinds of disaster or violence that we should be concerned about, because we know how to respond to disaster and violence as terrible things, we might need to be able to imagine those unfolding on a larger scale so that global climate change doesn't look catastrophic the way an earthquake does. But if you stretch it over 1,000 years and put that 1,000 years in fast forward, it could look about as dramatic. And maybe it wouldn't be a mistake to, and maybe we could learn to have a 1,000-year imagination at the same time that we can think about what happened yesterday.
Yeah, this is wonderful. Thank you. I'd like to ask you about the impact. Both of us grew up, at least partly, on what were effectively farms. One of my favorite Jed stories, I think Guy Charles had been running and had been effectively nearly attacked by a dog, which his owner said, "Oh, what can you do? Dogs can't be controlled." And you, sort of smiling, like warm, fuzzy Jed, said, "I grew up on a farm where when our animals misbehaved, we shot them." And I was like, "That's true." Yes, yes. I was so with you. Everyone else was like, "Oh my goodness, here's the hipster Thoreau shoots things. It's awful." And I thought, no, I understand this perfectly because to be a sentimental farmer is to be broke
and possibly chewed up.
Right. But I mean, this is a wonderfully romantic book about de-romanticizing nature, and it's the prose is just gorgeous. And at the beginning, you talk about the Apollo picture of the Earth, from space, and if I could just very briefly read a passage, which I think is much prettier than the one you read. You say. You're talking about all the terrible things that are in nature, the reminders that nature does not love us or want us to be happy, Lyme disease, birth defects, the everyday theater of wild suffering, the house cat hunting birds in the backyard, coyotes bringing down terrified deers, to the thousands of ticks that can immiserate and exhaust an unlucky moose in the Rocky Mountain summer. There's no harmony waiting for us in that globe, but the blue marble on the infinite black background is still the only possible home of everything we can love, which is about the most romantic de-romanticization I think I've ever read. It just the fact of growing up as both an intellectual and a man of nature, and to do so in the context of West Virginia, to do so in the context of a farming community, how has that shaped the particular kind of environmentalism that you now have and articulated, I think, even from your first book, For Common Things, all the way to this one?
That's a really generous question, and the passage you picked out is one of my favorites in the book. In fairness, it's also one that Lisa picked out.
I was told not to read it. Just so you know. It's okay because I didn't.
Exactly. So I do really feel pretty deeply formed by the landscape where I grew up. I literally, a few people in this room know this, dream in topography. I have dreams every week or so about discovering new terrains around here. And I could draw them for you like on a Tolkien map. The places around out Irwin Road or up Roxborough Road, where in my dreams, if you start walking up these dinky little Piedmont hills, they don't stop, but they keep rising. And you go through the pines into a meadow, and then eventually the meadow goes either into a rolling ridge or into a sort of rocky upland. I wake up so happy and relieved, and then I remember that we live in a place where you could throw a rock and hit the horizon. I think I sort of knew even when I was growing up there, and I certainly know now, that that landscape is really in so many ways a ruined landscape. Most of the topsoil is gone, and it's been gone for a long time. The creeks are silted up. The topsoil is gone because it was settled incompetently, in an ecologically incompetent way, and also by people who were desperately poor. They tried to transfer English and Scottish farming patterns to a land that couldn't take it. Then they grazed it even more heavily with sheep to feed a wool boom during World War I because they needed wool for uniforms, and that was pretty much the end of the topsoil. It's a huge extraction region, natural gas and coal, and you see signs of that everywhere. And the coal industry now is irreversibly changing. Southern part of the state where I grew up, though not exactly where I grew up, dynamiting it and leveling it. So I think it's one thing to grow up in a place like Boulder, Colorado, or even Boston, where there are these beautiful preserved lands right outside of town, and you know they're going to be there. I say in the book that if the place you grew up with is an Appalachian upland, and if you love it, then loving it has prepared you for heartbreak, because it's not only fragile, it's also kind of already gone. So I think that one of the challenges for a kind of environmental aesthetics, and aesthetics has always been an important part of environmental politics. What's beautiful? What moves people? And what do they do to try to preserve that? Is to figure out a way to appreciate places that are ruined, to care about places that are ruined and damaged. Nothing has been pristine or truly wild for a long time. While I'm sure there's something to be said for making gradations between places that are more ruined and places that are less ruined. And one thing I would want to resist is falling into the idea that a strip mine can be just as beautiful as a forest floor, which some art photographers will sort of lead you to believe, and also people who take pictures of ruined Detroit. You saw that Onion piece, last possible photograph of ruined Detroit taken by hipster photographer, molding pianos in the old opera houses. Still, we've got to figure that out. And I hesitate to say that I have any special advantage in figuring that out, but it was in some ways the only way that I could ever think in an honest way about these questions.
To add to that, it seems that a number of things that you said, from the issue around climate injustice to the abuse of power to the need for participation, to me all that seems like a strong leeway to getting to that would be to adopt a human rights-based approach. And I'm wondering what potential you see for that, and I haven't read the book, unfortunately, yet. I will over Christmas. But is the reason that you don't view that lens, is it this economic factor that you mentioned at the end and the need for economic security first almost? Or what's the relationship you see there in taking this forth and recasting our environmental imagination through a human rights-based approach?
I think it sounds great. I think it depends on what the rights are and who defines them and how they're enforced, of course. It's a kind of trivial answer. It hasn't been the focus of my work for a number of sort of random reasons, but I think this is, as much as anything, an area where intellectually and practically the strategy is to do everything at once. We need everyone working on every front, so absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks so much. Thank you, Lisa.